Hey there, I'm John Hayes, and thanks for joining us for this episode of the Founders Trust Podcast. Today, we're discussing how founders can start building a culture of effective management in their startups. I spoke with my good friend and the founder of Lead Connext, Erin Brown. Erin and I discussed why management often gets a bad rap, the importance of structure in facilitating good management principles, the idea of management versus mentorship, and a whole lot more. So I'm really excited to share Erin's perspective with you today. And stick around to the end of the episode for how you can enter our contest for a free 3-minute promotional video for your startup. So let's jump right in. Today's Startup Spotlight is brought to you by Savier. Savier takes a personalized approach to helping entrepreneurs create a clear path to growth. Through knowledge, coaching, and marketing services, Savier helps entrepreneurs and small business owners apply marketing to achieve their business goals. At Savier, our goal is to empower entrepreneurs to achieve marketing success. Check them out at Savier, that's savvyeur.com today. Hey everyone, I'm here with a good friend and fellow founder, Erin Brown of Lead Connext. Erin, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I know you have a really busy schedule, but really excited to have you on. Get your thoughts and your progress updates on Lead Connext, a fellow founder institute company. See the great progress you're making, and overall, just get your perspective on how you instill a culture of really effective management and leadership within a startup from day one. So thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yep. Thank you, John, so much for having me. It's great to be here. Obviously, John and I connected in the Founder Institute Accelerator program, which was fantastic, and have remained friends ever since. So as John mentioned, my name is Erin Brown, and I am the founder and CEO of Lead Connext. To give you a little background on myself, I spent about 12 years in the commercial insurance industry, so on the whole corporate side of business. In that time, I worked with contractors, real estate developers, hospitality firms, but in my career there, transitioned into team leadership roles, led a team of small as 8 up to a team of over 40 for about 4 or 5 years. And that's really where I found my passion for better supporting and empowering the next generation of leaders, specifically those first-time and middle managers, which is really where the idea for Lead Connext was born. And we're really, our mission at Lead Connext is to help managers become the leaders they aspire to be. So I'm going to take a few minutes and share some information about Lead Connext.
Absolutely.
So the problem we're looking to solve, and this is one I personally experienced, is 2 out of 3 managers are disengaged in their roles. And why does that really matter if we look at it on the surface? Is these same managers are the ones that are really responsible for the experience and thus engagement levels of all the employees they're leading. And if you look at the photo of that woman, she looked completely overwhelmed, has a ton of people coming at her. And I have been in that seat and spent many years in that seat. You have your bosses, your peers, your direct reports, project clients, everyone kind of coming at you, needing everything at once. And managers can easily feel stressed. They can feel overwhelmed, and at times even isolated and lonely without that support. Kind of compounding the issue is most first-time managers don't receive any initial training when they first make that transition into a leadership role. Only 50% of new managers receive any training. Yet in a recent survey, 98% desire more training, both first-time through middle-level managers. And kind of all that sums together when we're talking about employee experience and culture engagement is the lack of this ongoing development, support, resources, engagement of middle managers could be costing companies up to $450 billion a year. So that's the real tangible, quantitative side of the problem. What Lead Connext, what we're looking to do is we interviewed a couple dozen managers on what they were really looking for. And the most common theme we heard is, I just want to talk to someone who's been there, who's really been in that seat and who understands what they're experiencing. And so what we built is a peer-driven leadership community where we're bringing together these managers, so emerging first-time and mid-level managers, and connecting them with leadership and career coaches as well as HR professionals. And through this community, as well as the adjacent development platform, we obviously offer the collaborative community that I spoke about, but virtual peer groups as well, where we're connecting managers from different companies to really have that safe space to talk about and navigate the challenges they're experiencing. We're vetting leadership and career management coaches so we can connect them with one-on-one coaching services, and then aggregating and vetting various leadership resources as well. So really our goal with Lead Connext is to be that place that first-time and middle managers can come to, that they can access the support and resources they need and learn how they best learn kind of throughout their leadership careers as they go from emerging leader to first-time leader into those mid-level manager roles. To give a little background kind of on the market opportunity for leadership development, it's a huge space. About $14 billion in the US alone is spent on leadership development externally. That does not even include what companies spend on internally developing their employees. Frontline through middle managers is about $6.2 billion. And at Lead Connext, with my background in the insurance industry, we're really focused on that small to mid-sized financial services company, which is about $1.4 billion from a market opportunity standpoint. And how we're different, there's a lot of competitors in the leadership development space, not going to sugarcoat it. There's obviously coaches, there's programs, there's courses, there's workshops, there's even coaching platforms. But at Lead Connext, what we're really focused first and foremost is that community and the peer-driven side of things, which is really unavailable on average within that first time through middle manager space. It's something that's much more common in the senior and executive level space that we're looking to bring down to the first time and middle managers as well. It's personalized and customizable for both the managers, for them to choose how they best learn, but also from their companies that they can set their development budget by role, by individual. It's really flexible for both, as I mentioned, the managers and their companies. And then we're really aggregating and vetting those different resources as well, so the companies and the leaders don't have to themselves. That's kind of a high-level overview where we kind of are focused on needs right now, building out the advisory board, looking for kind of organizational psychologists or kind of leadership experts that are really focused in that space, as well as B2B sales. Kind of during COVID, we pivoted a little bit to start with supporting and empowering managers directly and connecting with them directly rather than through their companies. But over the course of 2021, really want to expand more into that true B2B space. And then intros, as I mentioned, pilot customers, as well as we're actively recruiting leadership and career coaches. And then team. Obviously, we're always, John, as you know, looking for team members. I would say right now, marketing and sales is our top priority, as well as potentially e-learning as we continue to grow as well. So thank you for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, Erin, thank you so much for sharing your pitch of Lead Connext with us today. I love this company. And honestly, it's just so remarkable to see your progress over the last 2 years with it. And having been there with you from the beginning as you were really formulating it, working through the business model, working through the value proposition, and the
Yep.
different ways in which you apply your leadership and management services to that level of middle managers is something that, and you're right, and you touched on it, that level is just overlooked. And that
Mhm.
is something that I thought was brilliant from the start and continues to be a real game changer for Lead Connext. And that, yes, there are
Yeah.
resources available for, the C-suite and executives.
Right.
But think about it just mathematically, how many more middle managers are there in America than there are C-suite executives?
Yeah.
And that is something that those people are really moving the needle on a day-to-day basis because they're handling the execution of
Yep.
things. And so to provide leadership and management coaching to that level of people who are making progress executing on a daily basis, I think it's just brilliant. So I'm
Yeah.
so excited to see that Lead Connext continues to make progress. And thank you for sharing your pitch with us today, because I think this is an opportunity to help connect your company with advisors, investors, and professionals to join your team to really help take you to the next level.
Yeah.
So
Nope. Thank you. As you know, I'm super passionate about the leadership space, obviously going into this, but I think, to your point with first time middle managers, they're really the ones in control on some level of the experiences of employees. And we talk so much about cultures, which we're going to get into, and they're really the ones kind of building the cultures, at the ground level, kind of with their teams. Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. So from your perspective, getting into that discussion of culture, what are the key principles of effective management and then of effective leadership? And then do you view them as being the same, different, or how are they interrelated in your perspective?
I mean, I would definitely say to start, they're interrelated, but I think management gets a really bad rap, the term manager, right? However, it doesn't need to be. So if you take management in the simple terms, like management oftentimes is about task or processes, where leadership is about people and empowering people and helping them achieve their goals. But you need both in any company. One without the other, you're not going to be successful. So if you look strictly at management, I would say like that's where you're really setting your goals and direction. It's recognition. It's a lot of the things we know we need to do. It's listening, it's teamwork, it's building kind of the foundation, right, of the team versus leadership is all about inspiring and motivating employees and helping them achieve their goals and that people first mentality. And so I think even with Lead Connext, we talk about, even though we're focused on like helping people become the leaders they aspire to be, we're also helping them. There's so much stuff that is more managerial, whether it's budgeting or setting strategic priorities, all of those things, they're equally important. And especially with any size company, but especially in the startup world as well.
Well, I'd imagine one thing that you probably come across is the fact in dealing with middle managers, they probably, I'm sure in some ways it almost feels, I don't know if disingenuous is the right word, but given their understanding of their role, maybe they don't feel like they're leaders, right? But
Yeah.
they understand that they're managers. And I think there's maybe a mental hurdle that comes with that, or maybe a conflict that people think is there but really isn't. How do you help people who either don't view themselves as leaders, or maybe view themselves as being out of place to be a leader given their particular role in a company? How do you help them overcome some of those maybe mental hurdles that they face in trying to elevate their managerial and leadership skills, quite
Yeah.
honestly?
No, John, that's such a great point because I think oftentimes we're like, okay, you're moving into management, right? You're not moving into leadership, right? And I think the one thing about leadership, to kind of take a step back, is that has nothing to do with your title. Like you becoming an actual manager and having direct reports does not make you a leader. It's a title, right? And it comes with power and maybe more authority or more control, for a lack of better word, but it doesn't make you a leader. And so I think the hurdle is, and I think that's anyone, right? Is I think remember when I moved into a first time leadership role, sometimes you're so focused on being able to execute on the expectations you've been given, whatever that is, like hitting sales numbers, retention, recruitment, hiring, kind of all the tactical things. And I think what people fail to do, and I admit I did as well, is you don't really make that full mindset shift that goes from what it is to be more that individual contributor where you're only responsible for you, to them making that transition mentally first to being like, okay, it's not all about me now and kind of what I'm working on and what I'm responsible for. I'm now responsible for this group of people and helping them be successful in reaching their goals, as well as the team and organizational goals as well. So I think, to back to your question with whether it's founders can do or executives can do to help first time and middle manager make that transition, I think first and foremost is talk about it. I think so often they're just like, you've done great at your last role, you're fantastic, here's 5 people to manage. Maybe if you're lucky, you go to a 1-day course that like teaches you need to communicate, you need to do this, but then that's kind of it. And I think having that conversation and making it an ongoing conversation about more the leadership side, kind of identify what are your values as a leader? Like, how are you going to instill those in the team? How are you going to communicate those? Kind of what's your philosophy on working with people? I think a lot of that self-awareness and self-reflection piece gets overlooked in that transition side of it.
That's an excellent point. And one question that I wanted to make sure I asked today, and I think you just answered it before I even asked it,
I
was
jumped ahead.
no, and that's great because it's a natural flow in that some people are so talented at what they do, whether it's marketing, whether it's product development, that people then assume to move up or to take that next step in their career, they have to become managers, or it's an inevitable part of their career journey. And honestly, some people just don't want to do that. They just
Yeah.
want to focus on their thing. They want to execute at a high level. They want to be responsible for their work and their work only, and that's it. But they feel compelled to move into a managerial position because it's what's deemed to be beneficial for their careers, or it's
Right.
what the team is asking them to do. And that is especially prevalent in startups when you have a
Mhm.
limited number of people, limited number of resources, and everyone has to wear multiple hats.
Yep.
So, how can founders or executive teams of startups think about this natural conflict and how to manage it when they have people who are really talented at what they do and they need them to play a little bit larger of a managerial role, at least in the short term, but
Mhm.
they know that person maybe isn't crazy about being a manager or
Yep.
leading people?
No, that's a great question, and that actually problem is not isolated to startups. Obviously, I spent most of my career in the corporate side, and that was a very common issue there because that's the next step, right? You want to move up in an organization, no matter the size or industry. That means moving into a leadership role. And to be frank, to your point, not everyone wants to be in a managerial role, and not everyone should be in a managerial role. Not to any fault, that's just not where their strengths are and where they're going to bring their best to the company. So I think from a founder standpoint, taking a step back, first, I think founders, when they're in the very early stages, need to take a look at really what the values are of their company, but also of themselves personally. And when, because that's so critical, because then when you're interviewing and bringing on team members, is making sure there's an alignment at the foundation of what the values of the company are and what that actually means. And by that, I mean, like, what actions does that mean? What behaviors does that turn into, so that you can actually clearly communicate the company that you're working to build and ensure you're bringing on the right people. But to your question, then, I think, and it's a new way of looking at it that necessarily maybe hasn't been done, is not making management the only career path. And I think there's such an opportunity for niche expertise, or those subject matter experts, pick whichever word that you want to use for that, that really allows people to shine in an area that's they're most passionate about and where they want to learn and grow, whether that's more the project management, marketing, sales. I know this is kind of a mixed, people have different feelings about this, but oftentimes they say, like, true leaders, it doesn't matter if they actually know everything you do in your day to day. It's because it's a different skill set. It's the people side of the skill set. So I think there is an opportunity for founders to be creative because they're really nimble, right, with their teams. I think you need to make sure you're bringing on people that are good mentors and good peers and willing to coach people and willing to obviously wear the different hats. But do they have to be the manager? Not necessarily. You could potentially have someone who's managing across different departments, but is really good at coaching and mentoring and empowering people, and then pair them with a more senior person kind of in their domain, whether it's like software engineering, marketing, sales, etc. So I think it's just looking at creative ways to structure a team, that it doesn't have to be that hierarchical system that maybe we're so used to.
See, that's a really interesting point, Erin, because the wheels of my mind are turning already. But the way I understand kind of what you're putting forth is perhaps rather than the more vertical structure we're used to, you almost have a more horizontal, flat structure where you just focus by specialty or
Mhm.
expertise, right? And maybe you have the software developer who's really talented at what they do, less in a managerial role, but more in a mentorship role to maybe the three or two junior developers you have on the team who are working on front end and back end development respectively, right? And then you have
Mhm.
someone who's maybe managing across a finance and accounting function as opposed to a very strict vertical type
Right.
structure, which is interesting. And I think that model actually works really well for early stage startups who are trying to be nimble, trying to be flexible, trying to be efficient with resources, because then you have a little bit more room to insert your own creativity and initiative as an employee, right?
Mhm.
Not just even as a leader or what we'll term
Right.
in quotes a more manager. So it's a really interesting structure. And I admittedly have not thought about that myself in the terms of building my company. I'm not sure many others have as well. So I appreciate you bringing up that point because it certainly seems like it provides startups with the flexibility that they
Yeah.
need.
Yeah. And the other thing I'll add that related, but to your original question, is sometimes I think it's important to say you approach someone and about becoming a leader and taking on direct reports and they're hesitant and maybe they're like, oh, I don't think is flush that out. Is because sometimes people, it's like a lack of confidence. It could be they don't even recognize their own natural abilities that you may see that in them. You don't want to force it on them. That's not what I'm saying. But I think
Sure.
sometimes, especially in people that you maybe are moving into a management role for the first time, they may not see what you see in them, and that their peers see in them. And so really just make sure you have a good understanding of what the hesitancy is. If it's just something like, I'm not interested, that's not my cup of tea, for lack of, totally fine. But if someone's using a language like, well, what if I have to have difficult conversations, or how am I going to do this? There's certain things that you could then really support and offer training and resources that may just be an untapped skill and talent that they don't, and you haven't fully seen in them as well.
That certainly makes sense. And you have to wonder how much of people's hesitation to take on managerial or leadership roles comes from perhaps their own negative experience with maybe a bad manager in the
Mhm.
past.
Yeah.
And I think two areas that seem to be recurring themes in why people have those negative experiences with managers are either and on two ends of the spectrum, either the super hands-on micromanager who
Yeah.
doesn't give you room to breathe, or the incredibly hands-off to the point of no guidance manager who leaves you with no guideposts to structure your day-to-day.
Right.
That seems to be particularly the case when you're in a startup environment because the founders and early employees are so focused on the next product iteration or talking to customers, taking care of payroll, et cetera, that they sometimes either overlook putting together a structure in the
Right.
interest of staying nimble, or they can't delegate and are so hands on that it doesn't even make sense to have you on because you're just duplicating efforts.
Yeah.
How do you, with Lead Connext, tackle those two ends of the spectrum because they appear to both be really big issues when it comes to being an effective manager?
Yeah. I would say when like working with managers, is I think first people are going to have a natural management philosophy and they need to know what that is. Like people are going to, so I'll give an example for myself. Like I am someone who very much values freedom, whether it's in my role, in my responsibilities, and where I live, etc. And so micromanaging me is just completely disengaging, right? However, I would say to your point, I projected that on other people, right? And when I first moved into a leadership role, I probably didn't give as much direction as I should have. I kind of geared towards the more hands off. Oh, I have good relationships with people. They'll let me know if they need me. Well, right. So I learned, sometimes the hard way that that's not the right. You have to adapt to the people that you're leading. So I think first and foremost is knowing kind of which way you tend to go. But as a founder, and I think that's really important to me as a founder, because I think as you know, John, I'm sure when it's your baby, right, that you're kind
Of
of
course.
wanting to be all hands on, but at the same time, you have to let go a little bit and let people kind of put their own little, not special sauce, whatever you want to call it, but like, their ideas may be something you've never thought of that are completely fantastic for your company. But it's funny, that you asked this question. I came across a study recently that it was, I think it's from like Harvard, Stanford. It was like a collaboration study on the most successful startup founders. And they actually were the most hands-on, not in like a micromanaging way, but they were really kind of down in the trenches with their teams, talking with them, coaching them. And it makes sense, right? Because like as the startup gets bigger and it's growing and innovating and all of that, founders can get further and further removed
Sure.
from the day to day and the no different than a more traditional employee or a company. And so by being more hands on, I think they're a little more in touch with that. But I would say to your question, I think it's having those transparent conversations and asking your employees what they need, like what kind of style works best for you, and being adaptable to Sometimes it's a little more freedom and hands off. Sometimes it might be a little more hands on, especially if someone's new to a role. Your style is going to even vary depending on the individual and their kind of longevity, with the company as well.
That's really helpful, Erin, because I think your point on adaptability to the people you're managing is something that I know I certainly forget at times, and I'm sure many people who find themselves in leadership positions do as well. And so
Mm-hmm.
self-awareness of your own style, how that's projected onto your employees or team members, but then remembering that maybe your style isn't aligned with what they need
Yeah.
and what helps them get the job done at the end of the day. So it's a helpful reminder, I think, to all of us to just think about how we are projecting our leadership onto other people, but how they receive it. Because as a leader, you naturally have to be flexible in dealing with the circumstances or responses of your team. So
Yeah. Well, and the good
helpful.
thing is founders are flexible, I think, on average by nature, at least with growing and how they're building and who the client is and pivoting. It's just kind of applying that same flexibility and adaptability to how they interact with people as well. But it's hard to remember, right? When you have everything flying at you, sometimes
Of course.
you're going to go back to your natural reactive state in the moment. So I think that's always a challenge in those.
Definitely. And I think some things that help with countering that natural reactive state are when you put in place specific processes, procedures, systems that facilitate effective management and
Mm,
strong leadership. So, thinking about that for a second, the beautiful part about startups is you have this blank slate to
mhm,
build kind of whatever you want, right? Which can
exactly.
be great or it can be destructive if you don't build it the right way.
Yeah.
How do you think about some of those systems or tactics, so to speak, that founders in early stage companies should put in place to help develop managerial skills, whether that's training with Lead Connext, whether that's regular check-ins, etc. What are some of those things that founders and startups should start implementing early on to facilitate this long-term culture of effective management at a very practical level?
Yeah. So I think I love this question because I think one of the things I love about starting my own company is that you do have that blank slate, and I think that's fantastic for founders to be able to build the companies that they really want them to be. I think to your point, but they have to be proactive about it. I think there's a famous quote, I forget who said it. It's like your company will have a culture. It's just whether you create that culture or it creates itself. And I think we've all seen in the startup world cultures that go south. And that's
Of course.
very, very harmful, right, to the organization. So I think kind of starting at the beginning, I think founders really just need to be very strategic and tactical about what kind of culture they want to build. And I know we're talking more management and leadership, but that's kind of one piece of a larger conversation too, is that they need to really just make it top of mind from the get-go and then make sure you're hiring and just what competencies are you looking for in the people you're hiring, kind of what's your interview process that you're going through to make sure you're kind of vetting people through that and getting the right people in the right seat within the organization. But then once people are in there, I think first and foremost, I would say oftentimes founders don't have leadership experience themselves. So I think one thing that's very helpful is if they get coaching, whether it's through like a Lead Connext or whether it's one-on-one more, but executive coaching, or I know like VCs have gotten a lot more involved in that and making sure their founders have that executive coaching support, which I think is fantastic, is they need to develop leadership skills themselves first before they can obviously then coach and mentor people they move into leadership roles down the line.
Certainly.
But I think is two, there's creating the feedback loop is really that transparency and that communication. Founders have to be really open to hearing the hard truths sometimes, which isn't always easy, but I think is without the communication, that feedback loop that's ongoing, not like once a year. Sometimes we have the annual performance review or check
Yep.
in, is just keeping that ongoing conversation. Um, I think tactically, I just think it's built into all your processes. Like, how are you managing people, like in terms of one-to-ones? Like, what does your performance review structure look like? What is your hiring process? What is your day-to-day interactions and your expectations? So I know it's a hard question to answer in like a short, there's so many moving parts, right, with management and leadership, but making it top of mind would be an ongoing, not like we did this, check it off, next, is constantly checking back in to see what's working, what's not working, and then adjusting as needed.
Well, and it's interesting because everyone in startup world thinks of the feedback loop, or it's at least top of mind with customers and
Mm-hmm.
products. And everyone's always thinking about we need to get feedback from our customers, we need to incorporate it, we need to test it, we need to see what they think now. But why is it so difficult to then translate that internally to our own team, who are the people we're working with to serve those customers?
Yep.
And it seems almost to be put in reverse order if we aren't doing it internally, and we because then we're not keeping up with our team who's ultimately delivering the product or solution to the customers.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting point you make in that we need to incorporate that in almost everything we do with the business to ensure that we're getting that constant iteration. And sometimes I think people only focus on that when it comes to product, but it seems to make a lot of sense
Yeah.
internally as well.
No, that's a great point, and I think the only thing I would add with the feedback side, I'm more on the well, I guess it would be on both sides, but in this case, the employee side, is oftentimes companies solicit feedback and then don't really do anything with it. They're like, oh, we got our quarterly feedback. They don't circle back, and address any of the issues that come up and put a plan in place. So I think it's always closing that loop. Even if you're making like people want you to do X and you're like, hey, we made a decision not to do X, A, tell them, but then B, explain why. They may not like it, but they're going to appreciate that honesty and transparency, because after a few feedback cycles and nothing changes, nothing happens, it's just going to be like an eye roll, shrug, that you're not going to get the true honest responses that you're looking for on it.
That's a terrific point. It's not just listening to the feedback, but it's in engaging with it and either
Mm-hmm.
implementing it or not. And if you're not, then at least be transparent about why you're not.
Yeah.
And that's a great point. And I think that contributes a lot to either companies that are great about retention or really struggle with it, especially early on or as they're growing, because if talented people don't feel like they're being heard or listened to or have a voice, then why stay?
Yeah.
And I think that's something that's probably even more common in more traditional corporate America, where you have so many more middle managers who probably feel like they're trapped in this ground of implementing and listening to their employees and team members, but not maybe getting the support from higher ups. And I would imagine that probably contributes to a lot of the maybe animosity that people have towards
Frustration.
management. Right, frustration, much better word, much better word. But I would imagine that probably plays a pretty significant role in it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean,
Well,
just if I can tell a quick story there
of
is like I
course.
remember in my last role, they were making a pretty sizable change in the organization, and they got all the managers together and were like, okay, we want this to be a negative session. You tell us every single reason this won't work, right? And I'm like, this is great. And like we all had a lot of reasons like this wouldn't work. I mean, there was probably 50 reasons, but it was a pretty good session. It wasn't like, complaint fest. It was just like really tactical. What's standing in our way? What are our hurdles that we're going to have to overcome? We went through it and then nothing came of it. Like 6 months later, it's like, we're like, hey, what came of this? Oh, and then they just rolled out the change. And then, and it causes a lot of frustration, I think. I
It
think
hurts morale.
managers are willing to work with you, right? Like I think founders need to remember, like the team wants to work with you. They want to make the vision work if you get their buy-in. But I think you got to kind of always be closing that loop and making sure that they understand kind of where we are today and where we're going. And if that changes, why it's changing. And I think that's just, yeah, the communication piece.
Certainly. Let's touch
Yeah.
on that buy-in piece real fast. There's a great quote on leadership from Dwight Eisenhower, something to the effect of leadership is the art of getting other people to do what you want because they want to do it. And it's
Mm-hmm.
really instilling that idea of transmitting the vision of what you're doing and why you're doing it to people on your team. Sometimes that's easier for founders early on because they're getting all they have is vision. So that's
Hmm.
all they're preaching. It could be a little bit more difficult once there is either traction or not as much traction as you want, or when there's a real world tangible result to compare to that vision.
Yeah.
How do you recommend that either managers, founders, people who are trying to instill and transmit their leadership vision to other team members approach what can be a difficult topic when either you don't have much traction to back it up,
Hmm.
or maybe some of the results are running a little counter to what the great things you've professed are, right?
Yeah.
Because I think we all come across that at one point or another in our startup journey.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I mean, I think one, we touched on it a little bit, is the transparency, is being honest with people when, hey, it's repeated. So I'll have to even take a step back. Oftentimes, I think leaders communicate the vision maybe at an annual meeting. They touch on it and they're like, here's our vision, blah, 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 blah. Then it's not touched on throughout the year, and I think it needs to be something that's continually talked about, so people, it's front and center in the decisions you make and communicated in that way as well. But I also think oftentimes, secondly, I would say oftentimes founders, right? Because one thing I love about working in a startup, but then also having these relationships with startup founders, is they're so passionate about what they're trying to do and the problem they're trying to solve, which sometimes is more missing in the corporate space. But I think where founders can fall down a little bit when it comes to transferring that vision down to all levels of an organization is how those individual roles roll up to that vision. So how is the social media marketer, just making up an example, like contributing to that vision? Like, what role do they play in achieving the vision? And making sure that that's built in kind of when we talk about responsibilities and that we're setting goals at an individual level, is really make that tangible. It's not exclusively tied to business results, which are obviously critical for the success of the company, but also to the individual goals. So that way it's kind of constantly in the course of discussion that managers are having with their employees. So that way it doesn't get lost, within the minutia of the day to day, or not even minutia in the startup space, but like the energy and chaos of the day to day.
Of course. Well, I think that's a great point, Erin. Honestly, when you help people understand how they're contributing in a meaningful way, it just makes it so much easier to come to work because
Mm-hmm.
you know what you're working towards. You
Yeah.
have something, you can pin something on your mental board to say, yes, this is what I want to achieve, or this is the point behind why I'm doing what I'm
Yep.
doing. I think when you help people see how the puzzle pieces fit together, it just makes for a much more collaborative, energetic, and probably resilient culture too when things don't
Mm-hmm.
go your way. So I think that's a
Yeah.
great point.
Yeah, and it's
Before
also
we hop,
celebrating the little wins. Sorry, John, didn't mean to
oh no,
cut you
of
off. As
course.
I think founders, I did this recently that I admit is like you kind of hit a milestone and you're like, maybe you celebrate it, maybe you don't. You should. FYI is, but like making sure you're celebrating all the little wins along the way too, because so many times it's just okay. We launched this new product iteration or version. Okay, on to the next thing, is really making sure as a team and as a company and as founders, you're really taking that time to celebrate and recognize all those wins, because there's been a lot of blood, sweat, and tears that went into it, at least definitely on the employee level. So you want to make sure you're not just powering on to the next thing.
I feel like I say it all the time, but entrepreneurship and starting a company is such a roller coaster that you need
Mm-hmm.
momentum of the wins to get you through the downturn of maybe some of the drops on the coaster, right?
Yeah,
Because
absolutely.
it's just the natural progression of how these things work. But as you celebrate the little wins, it reminds you of what you're working towards and what you've been
Mm-hmm.
on board.
Yeah,
So before we hop into our 3-question grand finale, I just want to ask you one more theme specific question,
sure.
Erin. And that's, what's the best piece of advice you've received either about leadership, management, both, in the course of your career, and why?
Yeah. So I would say I touched on it briefly earlier, but I'll share. So I had one of my bosses had said, or my first manager, or I guess she was my manager when I first moved into a leadership role, is she had said, Erin, you really need to focus on active listening, which we all hear the term active listening, but she actually took the time to say, like, what does that mean? And she was like, take the time to truly be present in that moment when you're having the conversation. Try to quiet the inner voice that's preparing for how you want to respond or what you want to say next. And I think that was something, admittedly, I still have to work on. Like my brain just always moving. Like someone says something and I think, oh, well, this is what I want to say back and respond. And I think then we miss so much, right? And I think for me, I really learned to, taking notes helped me, like to be present, like not overboard in a way that's distracting, but like put down a few things, but then also repeat back what I heard to people is like, so let me, so let me just make sure I understood you correctly, because so much gets lost in translation, even if you are actively listening. But then in certain people like myself, I'm just always kind of thinking and worrying is the wrong word, but preparing for what I want to say next. Was that something that was a really good piece of advice? And honestly, I never asked her, but I was always curious, like, how does she know I'm doing that in my head that I'm preparing? But I think it changed how I navigated my conversation and relationships with the people on my team to make sure that I was really prioritizing being there and present and hearing them rather than moving at a million miles an hour in my head.
Oh man, that is such great advice because I think we just naturally do it. We naturally want to, and it doesn't even necessarily come from a place of, you know, malice or trying to overstep your bounds in terms of your conversation with someone. I think it's just because people are naturally want to engage and want to get their thoughts out there. But active listening is such a key piece, especially as a founder, because you're sourcing feedback from so many different people that you have to listen and
Yeah.
you can miss so much that is really critical to your business if you don't. So that's
Yep.
just terrific
Listen
advice.
more than you speak.
2 ears and one mouth for a person,
Yeah,
right?
there we go.
Well, Erin, let's move into our 3-question grand finale here. Number one,
Yep.
what's been your favorite moment working with Lead Connext thus far?
And that was a tough question. I was like, you sent that question, I would say, I not one moment, but I would say it little moments when people, like after a workshop or after a coaching session or after whatever, they reply back, this was exactly what I needed. They were, those moments where you get that feedback, right? And most people don't just offer up feedback. Obviously, if someone's like willing to take that time to send you a note and said, this is exactly what I needed. Thank you so much for that. Blah, blah, blah. It has helped me so much. I think that, especially in the leadership space, and especially over the last year with COVID and the pandemic, with so many leaders and especially managers struggling to navigate a whole new world, is hearing that and knowing it kind of provides that support, or that it lets you know that you're on the right track and that you're having the impact that you're seeking to have, and helping in the way that you're wanting to.
Oh, of course. It's that tangible customer validation, right? And
Mm-hmm.
leadership, obviously,
Yeah.
not a physical product. So this is a way to really get that tangible validation. And that's great to hear. And
Yeah.
I think that's a common theme among startups and founders when I ask this question is it's a summation of those little moments. It's tough
Mm-hmm.
for people to put their thumb on one particular one. So
Yeah.
certainly are in the multitude with that. But okay, question number 2. In what ways have you personally grown the most through this experience with Lead Connects?
Yeah. Oh, so many ways. So, I mean, coming from a very traditional corporate environment, especially one as traditional as the insurance industry, it was an adjustment. Kind of in the insurance industry, you cannot make a mistake. You get sued. You have to make sure every I is dotted, every T is crossed. So, I would say kind of a couple things was that good is better than perfect, which was really hard for me in the beginning to get my mind around. I was kind of at the beginning just spent too much time preparing and trying to account for every possible variable that could come up to make sure there weren't any issues. So learning to be a more adaptable in that space, and just everything you have to learn as a founder, right? Like I come from a customer service, operations, leadership background, marketing, sales, accounting, all of that. I would say my just from a tactical standpoint, the skills I've learned had been, and then also just getting even more comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think is a big lesson I've learned because there's nothing comfortable about being a startup founder
Not at all.
at all. And I know you know that personally. So I think, but you do, especially over the past year, right? You learn that you can handle more than you think you can, and that you'll make it through on average, one way or the other. You'll make it through.
Absolutely. Well, that comfort with being uncomfortable can be really difficult, especially when you're coming from a more corporate environment like insurance or consulting, where there's very clear structure in place. You
Mhm.
follow it, and you have your box that you work within, right?
Oh, yeah.
You get out of that, and it becomes the Wild West. But there's something very liberating about that as well. You have that creativity and that energy to experiment, to test different assumptions with your business, and there's
Hmm.
something very, at least I find very liberating about that, and I feel like makes me and other founders just it gives them that energy to
Yeah,
keep going.
absolutely. And I think you become so much more comfortable with failure,
Oh, for sure.
too, is because it's all trial and error, right? And you're learning what worked, what doesn't work. And you learn to be like, okay, it's not personal. It's not about what I want, it's about what the customer wants. And then you kind of learn to navigate that, which was a change and improvement for me personally in what I've learned over the past couple years.
It's all one great experiment, right?
Exactly.
All right. Well, last question here, Erin, before we let you go. What is the one thing that your company needs to take that next big step or reach that next big milestone? And you touched briefly on some of your asks at the end of your pitch, but if there was just one thing that would really move the needle for Lead Connext right now in your journey, what would that be?
I would say a very strong B2B sales advisor. Not coming from a sales background, that is something that, I know is an area I need support on. So I would say that would be a big game changer as we look to focus more on the B2B side in 2021.
Well, that's certainly a great needle mover and something that I know a lot of companies are looking for. And we're excited to share this opportunity with the Founders Trust community to help you find that person. So,
Yep.
for our listeners at home, if you have a strong B2B sales background, are interested in learning more about Lead Connext, please feel free to reach out to Erin directly through LinkedIn or email us at the Founders Trust podcast at markettrust.io. But Erin, thank you so much for joining us today. It was so great to learn more about your progress with Lead Connext, the difference you make for middle managers, founders, and just leaders in general, because it's really difficult. It's not tangible, as we touched on, and it often leaves people feeling frustrated. I just feel that Lead Connext provides such a great structure and process to help people process those emotions, feel more comfortable with leadership, and ultimately be more effective managers to
Mm-hmm.
drive greater results for their business. So thank you so much for joining us today. This has
No,
been a great
thank you so
conversation.
much, John, for having me. I love the conversation. Always love the opportunity to talk about leadership and culture and all those things. So thank you again. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. You're probably familiar with the fact that video content produces the best engagement rates online. But producing quality video content can be time consuming and expensive. So, to support our startup community, we're running a contest to give away a 3-minute promotional video about your startup that we will produce and edit for you. You get full rights to the final product, and you can share it on your website, social media, or really wherever you want. All you have to do to enter the contest is subscribe to the Founders Trust podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or one of our other channels. Take a screenshot confirming that you subscribed, and then send it to us at Founders Trust Podcast at markettrust.io. We'll pick a random winner from the entries and announce that person during next Thursday's episode. So subscribe to our channel and enter for a chance to win your free 3-minute promo video for your startup. So let me know what you think of today's episode. comment on our social media, or send us an email at founderstrustpodcast@markettrust.io. Now go get building.